right, good. So Monica, we'll get started in about a minute. The people are kind of getting logged on still, so we'll wait till everybody catches up. Okay, great. So welcome everybody. This is our last seminar of the year. We'll start up again in January. We'll take the first couple of weeks of January off as well, but we're not done, just taking a break. So we're happy to have Monica with us today. House rules are, if you have a question, just unmute yourself and jump in just like you would during a regular seminar, and then we'll leave the stream open afterwards for further discussion and questions. Okay. I believe we have Michele in the chat room, so if you'd like to ask a question via chat, you can do that as well, and Michele can respond. Okay, otherwise, Monica, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, so first of all, thank you very much for accepting my paper in this virtual seminar. It's a great pleasure to present my work, or our work. This is fairly recent and new work, so very preliminary. All comments and suggestions are very welcome. So as the title suggests, we're going to talk about two-sided market power in firm-to-firm trade. This is joint work with Vanessa Alviares and Ken Kikawa, both from USBC Sauder. I believe Vanessa should be in the audience too. And Michele Fioretti, as it was already said, is in the audience. He's from CNSPO. This paper is going to use data from the US Census, and so as such, the usual disclaimer applies. So the motivation for this paper: over the last 20 years, research in international trade has increasingly centered around individual firms. And we know from enormous evidence that firms participating in international trade and in global value chains, more specifically given the focus of our talk, are somewhat special. And there are two features of firms in international trade that have received increased attention over the recent years that are interesting for us. The first of these features is that these firms are granular. This means that not only are these firms large, but they also account for a substantial share of a country's total imports and exports. For instance, there has been evidence showing that a single exporter may account for up to 17–20% of a total country's export. Similar number can be found for imports, and these numbers are even larger if we look within 4-digit industries. Now, the second feature of firms in international trade is that they seem to exert substantial bargaining power over the terms of trade. And now, despite the importance of these two features, we have only a limited understanding of how granularity and market power of firms in firm-to-firm trade may affect prices. And this is because the traditional framework in international trade postulate that firms interact within anonymous markets where prices are pinned down by market clearing conditions. Now, similar assumptions obviously have implications for the way we think about the intensive margin response of global value chains to shocks. And ultimately, they also have implications for the global value, how we think about the global value chain resilience to shocks, which is something that is it's a timely question given the wide debate on global value chain resilience amid the current economic situation. Now, obviously, taking on such an endeavor entails many challenges. The first of these challenges is that data in international trade data usually come with one-sided information. So we have a lot of information on one side of the market, such as importers or exporters, but on the other side, we don't have as many information. So we don't know to which firms are selling to or buying from. The second challenge is methodological. Obviously, modeling several layers of granularity and market power is methodological, is complex in many dimensions. However, a theory of two-sided market power in trade can have a number of important applications for questions that are important for trade. The first of these questions is about the firm level determinants of pass-through elasticity onto import prices. And this, again, is another timely question given the wide debate on the recent US-China trade war. Studies have shown that following the tariffs imposed by the US governments, there has been an almost complete pass-through into US import prices and US consumer prices as well. And this is surprisingly from the point of view of standard frameworks in international trade and macro, which predicts that pass-through are incomplete in many horizons. The second applications that we have in mind is the one that has to do more with trade policies, in particular, given the fact that trade policies are increasingly targeting individual firms over and above individual industries, and therefore it's important to understand which firms are strategic from, again, a pass-through point of view. And in here, the example that one should have in mind is, for instance, in 2017, the US imposed an enormous, like 300% tariff on a specific firm, Canadian firm, which produced Bombardier's jet. So it was this sort of tariff and anti-dumping duty was targeting this specific firm, and this type of trade policies are more and more common. Now, to be a little bit more specific on how we tackle these challenges in this paper, we first build a two-sided trade data set, and this new novel trade data set includes detailed US import transaction information on import transactions, together with bilateral prices and balance sheet information on both importers and exporters. And I'm going to be very clear on how we construct this data set. And we use this data set to provide some stylized facts about the behavior of bilateral prices in firm-to-firm trade and how they relate to buyer-supplier match characteristics. Using this stylized fact, we're going to use these facts to motivate the assumption of our general theoretical framework. This is going to be a pricing framework, so a partial equilibrium one, where bilateral prices are determined by two-sided negotiations between importers and exporters, which again feature concentration and market power. We're going to use this framework to characterize the role of two-sided granularity and market power onto bilateral markups and pass-through elasticity onto import prices. The third contribution of this paper, and that I'm going to talk about today, is that we also develop a novel identification strategy for the main model elasticities. And here, the main empirical challenge that we're going to face is the fact that we don't observe the bargaining power that are match specific. So these terms are unobserved, and we provide a novel empirical identification strategy using our two-sided trade data set. So in case I run out of time, I want to make sure that I give you the main takeaways of today's talk. In terms of the evidence, we're going to show that a large share of imports happen through links that are multilateral. That means that they are characterized by two-sided heterogeneity. So it's important to take into account this two-sided dimension of trade in order to understand prices and price dispersion. The second result from the empirical evidence is that concentration among importers and exporters, as measured by the market share of buyers and sellers, and I'm going to be very specific on how we measure these shares, is significantly correlated.
Monica, what does it mean that the links are multilateral?
So I have, in the next slide, I'm going to provide a picture which makes this very clear. But just to fix ideas, what I mean is that each importer buys a given input from generally more than one exporter.
Okay.
So it's related to multiple exporters and vice versa. Okay, so in terms of the theory, our main theoretical result is a formula for the bilateral markup that relates this bilateral markup to concentration and market power among firms. In particular, we show that in our two-sided trade framework, the markups is going to be a weighted average between a pure oligopoly markup and a pure oligopsony markup. The weights between these two extreme markups are going to be determined by the relative bargaining power of the importers. So the higher the bargaining power of the importers, the more the bilateral markup is going to converge to the oligopsony markups and vice versa. And again, as you can see from this formula, which is again is the main theoretical result of this paper, this is all very tractable, and we're going to characterize these markups as a function of two market share of the buyers and sellers, which again are observed in our two-sided trade data set, and the bargaining parameters, which we are going to estimate through our identification strategy. The implications of our theory is that we're going to show that this theory of two-sided market power in trade is going to have implications for the pass-through elasticity onto import prices, which again are going to depend on the two-sided features of firm-to-firm trade. And finally, we're going to argue that trade policy should target specific strategic firms and sectors, and the comparative advantage of certain firms and sectors are going to depend again on how the market shares are distributed across importers and exporters. Okay, so in terms of the literature, I'm going to be kind of brief here, but we think we contribute to three main strengths of the literature. First and foremost, we contribute to a literature studying the firm level determinants of markups and pass-through. There's an enormous amount of work that I could cite here, just reported a few, but obviously in terms of the pass-through literature, the main papers that are related to ours is the work by Berman, Martin, and Meyer, and Amity, Tolkien, Konings, for instance. Then we also contribute to a literature on buyer-supplier production networks, in particular to non-competitive models of buyer-supplier relationships. In this sense, our work is very related to recent and contemporaneous work by Grossman and Heldman, who tackle a very similar question, but unlike our paper, they focus most on the extensive margin response of global value chains to shocks. And so in this sense, we see our paper to be complementary to theirs, because we focus again on the intensive margin response. Finally, we also contribute to a more young literature in structural models of bargaining. And again, our identification strategy for the bargaining power is sort of a novel way to estimate these parameters, which contributes to this literature. Okay, so if there's no question, I'm going to move on and start with data and the stylized facts. So as I said, we build a novel two-sided trade data set, and we are going to use two main sources of data. The first is the US Census. We're going to merge several data sets of the US Census. Our main data set is going to be the lifted data set, which includes matched US importer, foreign exporter information on bilateral unit values, so prices and quantity. Importantly, for each US importers, we also know, we observe an identifier of the foreign exporter. This identifier is so-called the MID. And therefore, the identity of the foreign exporter is known. And this is key in order to create this two-sided trade data set. We merge this trade data with firm level information, standard balance sheet information, which we take from either the longitudinal business dynamics data set or the census of manufacturers, depending on whether the firms are manufacturing firms. The second source of information is Orbis data. So we merge US Census data with Orbis data. Orbis data is the well-known multi-country firm level balance sheet data set. But the key information for us is that Orbis contains information on the name, address, and industry affiliation of these firms, which are the key information that we need to reconstruct the MID, the identifier of a given firm within Orbis. And this is the link, the variable that allows us to merge the US Census data with Orbis data set. Our sample spans the period between 2001 and 2016. And for our main results, we are gonna exclude related party transactions. The reason being that we think that our pricing framework applies to arm's length transactions more than related party ones, precisely because the latter have there are transfer pricing issues that are not captured by our framework. Okay, so this is to go back to John's question, what do we mean by the multilateral linkages? So the first stylized fact is sort of a portrait of firm-to-firm trade. We take a look at how these firms are related to each other, how these links look like, and we wonder what is the fraction of imports that happen within links that are multilateral, that involve a firms or an importer or an exporter that is related to more than one exporter or importer respectively. And as you can see here, by and large, imports involve links that are multilateral, namely so in this, the way you should read these pictures is that on the I's denotes the exporters and the J denote the importers. So 25% of the links, but 43% in terms of value involves exporters that sell to multiple importers and vice versa, importers that buy from multiple exporters. So what I what I want you to take from these pictures is that, again, the heterogeneity that is involved in these links is important, seems to be quantitatively important in terms of total value of imports. And so it's something that it sort of needs to be taken into account when thinking about price dispersion. Also, notice that our framework is going to allow for M2M kind of relationship, but obviously nests all the previous cases, such as one-to-one trade. And therefore, we take the most general framework that we can think of, precisely because it seems to be quantitatively important. Once we establish that this link seems to be multilateral, we ask ourselves what accounts for the observed variation in bilateral prices, and in particular, what's the role of the match-specific component. In order to do so, we propose a classical statistical decomposition of prices in firm-to-firm trade. This is sort of an AKM decomposition of prices, and this kind of exercise is standard with this kind of data sets, and is an exercise that, for instance, Fontaine, Mejean, and Meyer do in related work using French firm-to-firm data. Precisely what we do is to regress the bilateral price between exporter I, importer J at time t for a given HS10 product category on seller fixed effect, buyer fixed effect, product time fixed effect, and a set of controls, which include observations such as seller's experience, age of the relationship, size of transaction, and distance. What this exercise aims to do is to see what fraction of the variation in prices is accounted for by seller, buyer elements and match-specific components. So when we do that, what we find is obviously the bulk of the variation in prices is obviously accounted for product time fixed effect. So about 52% of the variation is explained by horizontal product differentiation. Including the difference between column 1 and 2 is whether or not we include observables. As you can see, including observables does not make almost any difference in terms of overall variation. The seller fixed effect seems to have a quite substantial impact on prices, but once we control for that, buyers, fixed effect, and match residual seem to have a pretty similar size in terms of explaining to overall price variation. More interestingly, when we focus on within seller product time fixed effect, what we find is that the bulk of variation is not explained by buyer fixed effect, but it's at the level of the match. So it's in the residual. So what we conclude is that these match-specific components seem to account for a significant share of price variation, in particular within seller product variation, which is the one that we're going to be focusing on mostly. The last stylized fact that I want to show you is we go one step further and think about what can account for this match-specific variation in prices. And to do so, we think about what is the role of bilateral concentration among importers and exporters. The way we measure seller concentration is, again, we take the structure of firm-to-firm trade, and we want to compute the measure of how important is a given seller, in this case I, for a given buyer J. In order to compute the seller share, we take total imports for buyer J, and this is going to be A plus B, and we compute the share of firm I in total imports of firm J, and this is obviously A over A plus B. This S is going to be our seller's share and measure, it's going to measure exporters concentration, so concentration among exporters. We're going to build a similar measure for concentration among importers or buyers. Obviously, in order to compute how important is a given buyer J for a seller I, we take total exports of firm I, and then we divide the imports from firm J, of firm J from firm I over total firm's export. This is a measure of how imports are concentrated in a given buyer. And these are our two measures of concentration among exporters and importers, respectively. Given these two measures of bilateral concentration, we augment the previous specification with these two market shares. Our goal here is to sort of account what fraction of, how this variation in bilateral prices is related to the size of the exporters and the size of the importers in terms of market share. Obviously, a similar regression is sort of troublesome because we are regressing effectively prices on market shares, and we know that it's very hard to interpret similar regressions. Obviously, we are not claiming any source of causality in this kind of regression. We just want to show qualitatively how these prices and concentration are related to each other. However, we do also consider an IV strategy to account for potential endogeneity, for the endogeneity of the market share. And we construct the instrumental variables by exploiting the network structure of firm-to-firm trade. I don't want to spend too much time on, yes. Hi,
just a quick question. How do you deal with products in that? Because I'm thinking some firms, maybe in some sectors where you need many inputs, maybe these suppliers are just different types of products. And in some cases, they may be within products. But, so you use total sales to those shares. I guess you're going to have some product fixed effects in this regression.
Yeah. So there are product fixed effects here. But I thought that you meant even within HS10 time fixed effect, we could have some product variation because these inputs are targeted or customized to a given buyer. So if you're thinking about unobserved quality differences, then that's a problem for us. But otherwise, this is the best we can do. Like this is how we account for product differentiation. Am I getting your question right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so our evidence, qualitatively, just correlational evidence shows that the larger seller, so the higher the market share of the seller, the larger the price, the bilateral price. So larger sellers charge higher prices, seem to charge. And similarly, that the market share of the buyer is negatively correlated with the price. So large buyers seem to be paying lower price in a given in firm-to-firm trade. Okay, so let me move now to the theoretical framework. This, that sort of builds on these stylized facts that I just showed you. What we're going to be thinking of is a framework of firm-to-firm.
Moni, just quick question.
Yeah.
So to what extent did you exploit like the transaction characteristics? So like big orders usually come with like a size discount and small orders don't, right? So is that stuff completely orthogonal to the size of the buyer seller sizes and stuff like that?
Yeah, we're not taking that into account. We probably should do something about that, like perhaps controlling for the what kind of, in which bulk this transaction is, like the size of the transaction. We're not controlling for that. Yeah, but yeah, this is something we should do. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Okay, so we're going to focus on the relationship between a given exporter I and a US importer J. As I said before, our model is allow for many-to-many network structure, but obviously it nests all type of network structure that you can think of, such as one-to-one or one-to-many. It's a pricing framework, so it's going to be partial equilibrium. And in order to tractably and feasibly analyze the equilibrium in this model, we're going to exploit the Nash equilibrium concept. That means that the price at the match level is going to be the Nash bargaining solution for that pair, given that all the other pairs reach an agreement. So it's a Nash equilibrium effectively. Now, in our baseline model, the equations that I'm going to show you today, we're going to assume that firms are single product. And then we're going to impose functional form restrictions. However, all the results generalize to multi-product firms, and this is, we're going to generalize when we bring the model to the data, and to general demand and production functions. So none of the results that I'm going to show you today are specific to the kind of functional form assumptions that we impose. In terms of notation, I'm going to use red to denote parameters and blue to denote observables. Okay. So here is a sort of, I'm trying to give you a sense of the model that we have in mind. It's a very simple and stupid picture, perhaps, but hopefully this helps fixing ideas. So again, we're going to focus on the relationship between an exporter I and an importer J. This is a US importer, so this is going to be the US porter. Many-to-many network structure, meaning that the importer is going to buy from multiple foreign exporters. And again, vice versa, each exporter is going to sell to multiple downstream importers. Now, this importer is going to import intermediate inputs from this foreign exporter, which it combines into a foreign intermediate bundle as it is standard. And in turn, this foreign intermediate bundle is used in production together with some domestic labor, domestic intermediate inputs. Production that yield a final good, which is sold to downstream demand, which we're gonna denote by QJ and PJ. So when there's only the buyer's index, this means that it's final demand. Also, we're gonna, since this is effectively a setting of a global value chain, we're gonna allow this exporter I to, in turn, purchase its own inputs from upstream suppliers. And so we're gonna model even the upstream market for exporter I. Okay, so that said, let me walk you through each building block. I'm gonna have this figure here that helps you fixing idea of where we are in the supply chain, starting from the final demand. As I said, very simple assumption in this baseline model, but this can be generalized. For downstream demand, we're gonna assume that these firms compete in a monopolistic competition sense with CES demand. So the key parameter for downstream demand is gonna be the demand elasticities, which we denote by nu. And obviously, CES demand plus monopolistic competition implies a constant markup in the downstream market. The notation is standard, Q is output, P is price, C is marginal cost, and U is markup. Okay, moving up to the production function of this US firm, J, we're gonna assume a constant return to scale production function. In the baseline model is gonna be Cobb-Douglas for simplicity, which combines domestic labor, domestic intermediates, and foreign intermediate inputs. So the superscript F here denotes the fact that some of these inputs are imported, so it's foreign. The key parameter here is this alphas elasticities. These are the output elasticity of each individual inputs. In the case of constant return to scale Cobb-Douglas production function, this also corresponds to the cost share of a given input, foreign intermediates, for instance, in production, which is something that we can observe in the data. And that's why this is a key parameter for our main results later on. And this is something that we can observe. This production function is going to have a dual unit cost function, which is the following, which is very standard. Moving up to the foreign intermediate bundle, these inputs that the firm imports from abroad are combined in a CES fashion. The important elasticity here is rho, which is the standard elasticity of substitution across foreign intermediate varieties. We're going to allow for some demand shifter here. It's quite general. Importantly, there is a quantity index and a related price index. The price index is an index of these bilateral prices that are negotiated upstream. So these prices that belong to the foreign price index are the focus of our analysis.
So the parameters, the alpha and the zeta size are firm specific.
Yes, exactly. But these are not going to be, the ones that are not highlighted are not going to be crucial for our main results. The ones that are highlighted is what's very important. And so what the ones in red, we're going to estimate. The one in blue is what we can observe. Yeah.
So Monica, one small thing. I don't know if it's going to matter, but because of that Cobb-Douglas in the previous slide between all the domestic and the foreign, I guess that can have implications for the outside option, I guess, of relying altogether in domestic suppliers. Probably, I don't know, maybe it doesn't matter, but because you're not going that route, you might be going into just going with some other foreign supplier as your outside option.
I'm going to come back to that point of the outside option. That's crucial for us. So I want to spend more time on that when I get to that. But good. I mean, this is a great, excellent point. But I'm going to come back to that. Okay. So upstream supply, as I said, there's going to be an upstream market for exporter I. We also take a very simple functional form assumption. We are going to assume that production upstream is again Cobb-Douglas. It's linear effectively. It only uses one foreign input bundle, which we denote by big I. What's important here is that we allow for return to scale in the upstream production. So the theta in the production function can be greater, equal, or below 1. And when it's equal to 1, that's the case of constant return to scale and linear production function. When it's below 1, it's a very interesting case for us, and it's the case of decreasing return to scale upstream and increasing marginal cost. The reason for which we allow for decreasing returns upstream is that buyer power plays a role in equilibrium as long as there are rents in upstream supply, and therefore as long as marginal costs are increasing. But again, I'm going to come back to that later.
So there's a big asymmetry between the buyers and the seller's production function. The buyer,
well, the reason, yeah. So
the
you're saying
seller
this,
isn't negotiating with the inputs she's buying.
right. So we have an extension where the seller has market power. We don't model negotiation though upstream. We have this extension allows for buyer power of the seller upstream, and in reduced form sort of captures the bargaining problem. However, the reason why we simplify this this layer of the global value chain is because we have limited data that we can use to sort of discipline these elasticities. But again, we in the paper we showed that this is robust to having more realistic assumptions even upstream. Okay, so this is the main equilibrium problem. Again, it's a Nash bargaining problem. The importers and exporters are going to negotiate over the price. The key parameter is obviously the phi ij, the bargaining power of the importers in our notation. This is between 0 and 1. Now back to the outside option. Here, what we're going to, another key parameter is obviously the outside option of the importers and exporters. In our model, in this baseline model, we take a sort of a simplifying assumption by saying that the outside option of firms are going to be the profits if this link is terminated. So as if a given buyer is that if the buyer does not reach an agreement for a given seller, is going to buy inputs for from all the remaining links that already exist in the network. So we don't allow for a negotiation, and it's sort of you can think of this as being a short run elasticity, a short run outside option for buyers and sellers. Now, this is even more general than it may look for reasons that are going to come back later. But what you were saying, Joachim, yes, and it enters here. And specifically, that assumption is going to affect this specific outside option. However, it's a bit more general, as I will explain. Yes.
No, I just guess what I was going to say is if you have a single foreign supplier, then if you exclude that link, go with the Cobb-Douglas you had back there, then your profits are kind of minus infinity, or I don't know what that. So that's, but maybe you're just focusing on as you say, multi-links relationships, or
we do focus on multi-links. Yes, again, the Cobb-Douglas is not as critical as you may think, because what matters for us is basically the cost share of the foreign inputs. Obviously, the cost share is equal to 1 of a given firm. If it's all concentrated in one firm, then yes, you're right. They're gonna have a very large impact on the outside option. But yeah, I mean, we need to think about that a little bit more. But yeah, I don't think it's that critical in terms of it's a partial equilibrium after all. So I think in that sense it's less critical than it may seem. Nash solution, as I was saying, they reach a Nash equilibrium. The solution is a Nash bargaining solution, given that by taking as given the demand downstream, supply upstream, and the extensive margin of the network. Okay, so getting to the main equilibrium result, main theoretical result, we show that the first order condition yields a standard equation for prices as a markup over the marginal cost, the supplier marginal cost. The markup, importantly, we show that it has this very tractable analytical form, which is a weighted average between a pure oligopoly markup and a pure oligopsony markup. The phi tilde here, we define it as being the relative importer's bargaining power. So the bargaining power of the importer divided by the bargaining power of the exporters. As the relative bargaining power of the importer increases, the omega share increases and the markup converges to the pure oligopsony markup. And I'm now going to describe each of these terms individually, starting from these specific cases to sort of fix ideas with models that we may know better. So when we assume that the seller has all the bargaining power, so in the case of price-taking buyers, and this is the standard, I think, case that we consider in trade theories, our model, our solution converges to the standard Bertrand model, where the markup is the pure, what we call the pure oligopoly markup, which is epsilon over epsilon minus 1, where the demand elasticity epsilon is a function, is a weighted average of the elasticity substitution across imported inputs and demand elasticity downstream, the weights being proportional to the seller market share. In particular, in this case, we show that the bilateral markup is an increasing function of the seller market share, as in the standard Atkinson-Bernstein model. So our model nests the standard Bertrand case as the limit where the seller market share, the buyer's bargaining power goes to 0. In the other extreme case, when the buyers hold the bargaining power, the markup converges to the pure oligopsony markup. Now, in this case, this equation may not look very familiar because we don't usually think about the case of pure buyer power, but it can be decomposed into steps. So when production upstream is constant return to scale, as I said, it's sort of an uninteresting case for us, because this is the case where marginal costs are constant, and therefore, regardless of the buyer share the market share of the buyer, the price is always going to be equal to the marginal cost. And so the markup is always going to be equal to 1 in the case of constant return to scale. However, when production is decreasing return to scale, so theta is below 1, the buyer can exercise market power over prices, and in particular, it can bring prices below marginal cost. And in the limit case, when the buyer share is equal to 1, the price is going to be equal to theta, which is the return to scale parameter, which means that the markup is equal to theta, which means that prices are equal to average cost, which is the lowest as they can get. This is the general case. As I said, this is a weighted average. So this is one way in which we can plot the markups as a function of the exporter concentration or the importer concentration. Obviously, for a given level of buyer's relative bargaining power, the markup is increasing in the seller market share and decreasing in the buyer market share. But where in the parameter space we are depends on the seller market share, the buyer market share, and the bilateral market power. So obviously this picture tells us that we can get a very rich portrait of markups depending on the configuration of market share and relative bargaining power. Notice that the standard Melitz model with monopolistic competition and CES demand will be just 1 point in this figure, which corresponds to the case where the sellers has all the bargaining power and the market share is equal to 1, the firm being a monopolist. Okay, so yes.
Just a quick question. So one challenge with like an Atkinson-Bernstein type setup is that the only way you can get incomplete pass-through is to have market shares be the different goods be very substitutable, and so market shares have to move around a lot. Is that going to be a feature of this model where market shares are going to have to move around a lot to get incomplete pass-through? Because kind of at the macro level, we think like trade elasticities are pretty low. So just, can you give me some idea?
Yeah, I'm gonna get to the pass-through right now. But yes, we're gonna.
The question was really about like pass-through is also related to like the elasticity of substitution, and so you can't kind of get in. Are you going to be able to sort of kind of get incomplete pass-through with low elasticities of substitution? That's kind of the challenge.
Yes, we're gonna. Our framework, we do have the same channel that it is in the standard Bertrand model when it comes to sellers. For instance, when you focus on the seller market share, we're also gonna have extra channels that provide incomplete pass-through even when the elasticity substitution are not very large. So we do have additional channels for incomplete pass-through if that. Yeah. And this is it's coming next. Yeah. So as it is, as George was anticipating, the obvious implication of our theory of markups and prices is to think about the price elasticity to a given shock. And here we consider a generic cost push shock denoted by var theta. You can think of this as being a tariff shock to the exporter marginal cost. And when we do that, we can decompose the bilateral prices, the log change in prices as the log change in markups, which in our model can be decomposed in the components. So the seller market, the change in the seller market share and the change in the buyer market share as weighted by the markup elasticities to these two different shares. the change in marginal cost, which is going to be important, and this is the extra channel that I had in mind when suggesting that we have an extra channel for incomplete pass-through, because in the model where marginal costs are increasing, then costs also are going to adjust following a given shock, and obviously the shock itself. So our theory yields a sort of a tractable characterization of the pass-through elasticity of a given shock into the input prices. We define the pass-through elasticity as being, again, as how much following a given percentage shock in the tariff, the price is going to change. And this is our, how this elasticity looks like. So we're going to have three different channels that are at play in our model. The first one is what George was anticipating. It has to do with input substitution related to the market share of the firm. Then we're going to have an extra channel related to the endogenous buyer power, and then a final channel related to the cost, the movement of the cost. And I'm going to explain each of these channels individually, starting from special cases.
Monica, usually we don't think that cost channel is. Usually we try to control for the common movements in cost by looking at the pricing to two separate markets. So, is this cost channel going to be really important for you? Because it seems like this, like the original kind of netter regressions kind of take this term out, because that's going to affect all of your sales to all your markets the same way, right?
Well,
incomplete pass-through is usually about how I price differently across these markets, or maybe that's what I call pricing the market.
Well, I don't think it does. So basically, we are going to focus on within selling across buyers. So I mean, yes, you're right. In the sense, this is more of a theoretical point that we are making, right? Here, rather than a more empirical, saying whether we can reconcile the observation of incomplete pass-through, because usually these regression include seller time fixed effect, which usually take care of changes in marginal cost.
Yeah.
So maybe in that sense. But let me just trying to go over each individual step. So the first one is, again, let's starting from the benchmark that we all have in mind. When the suppliers all the bargaining power, the pass-through is going to be related to how much the markups of the seller change in response to the shock. And here we get, again, the standard U-shape relationship between the pass-through elasticity and the supplier's market share. What's the intuition here? This is what George was suggesting. When the shock hits, then and inputs are substitutable, so there is higher elasticity substitution across inputs, then the price of a given seller is going to go up. If the seller's market share is going to go down, because firms' buyers are going to substitute away from a given seller, and therefore the seller responds by lowering the markup, and therefore there is incomplete pass-through of this shock into the prices. So this is the standard channel through which seller reduces markup to absorb part of the shock that is caused by the tariff increase. On the contrary, when the buyers has all the bargaining power, we get an opposite effect. So now here, I would really, again, focusing on the case where we can control for changes in marginal costs. So focusing on the markup channel of the buyer, of the effect of buyer power. So on markups, what happens is that we find that the pass-through elasticity has a hump shape in the buyer's market share. So so here the intuition is sort of a reverse than the standard one of the seller case. So what happens is that when the tariff hits, the cost shock hits, the price goes up automatically, and the quantity will go down because of a demand effect. As the quantity of the buyers goes down, so does the buyer share. And as the buyer share goes down, the oligopsony the markup is going to go up, because effectively the buyer power is going to decrease with the buyer share. As the markup is going to go up, this will amplify the effect of a tariff on the markup. So effectively the buyer's market power provides an amplification channel for the tariff pass-through, for a pass-through of a tariff shock. And so this is a force that counteracts the incompleteness of pass-through that is obtained by the seller channel. Again, in this case, critical to have an impact of buyer's power is going to be that there is decreasing return to scale upstream. Obviously, when there is constant return to scale upstream, theta is equal to 1, and we're going to have a complete pass-through at all horizon for coming from this buyer's channel. When we put all things together, the picture that emerges is sort of richer than what is achieved from standard models. So here what I plot is the pass-through elasticities as a function of buyer share in the x-axis and seller share in the y-axis for 3 different values of the bilateral market power. So in the first case, we're going to have the standard case of bargaining power concentrated on the seller side. In the panel C, we're going to have the case of bargaining power concentrated on the buyer side. And in the middle panel, it's the picture where bargaining power is equally distributed among sellers and buyers. Obviously, there is a whole range of levels of bargaining power that we could have here. Just obviously for in interest of space, I reported 3 key cases.
Okay,
so what is the
Monica,
yes.
Just a couple of questions. The shock here is specific to the buyer-seller pair.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm just thinking in terms of when people go out and measure these elasticities, I think they often use exchange rates.
Yeah.
But that would apply to all the firms involved, I mean, all the exporters, right? So if this is a large country or a large source for this product, then this shock would apply to competitors as well, right?
Yes.
But you're
in terms of this, in terms of the theory, we're thinking about the shock that hits at the seller level. However, when we as I said, this is still work in progress. So I'm not gonna have any empirical specification, pass-through specification today. So I just wanted to, it is mostly about the theory, but the way we're thinking about when we're gonna bring this model to pass-through specification is that, we are gonna think about tariff shocks that do not apply perhaps to individual firms, but to sellers from a given country. But what's important is that we could measure the firms that are affected by this shock. Mm-hmm. And so effectively, the case that I showed you for theoretical expositional purposes is a specific one, but we can discipline, given our knowledge of how the shocks is going to hit different firms.
And also the decreasing returns to scale are
mm-hmm.
going to matter not only for this supplier, but for the other suppliers to the buyer as well, right?
Yeah.
Is that behind here in what you're?
Absolutely, yes. So it's in the paper. It's not here because it's kind of like, but basically we are gonna control for how much the cost changes because of other people's also changing demand following the given shock. So we have this sort of general equilibrium effect of aggregate demand effect on costs. We do characterize that in the paper as well. And the way we interpret the pass-through regression, again, depends on how we specify the regression empirically. So depending on which fixed effect we want to include and so on and so forth. So again, this is just exposition, to show the theory and what the theory can do. Does it answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay. Okay, here I just want to, as I said, since this is, I'm not going to be able to show you results because it's still work in progress. What I wanted to show you is sort of the direction that we want to take with this framework and how we want to use this framework to think about the problems that I mentioned at the beginning. So here, it's just for, again, expositional purposes, I want to show in the case of washing machine, which again is the interesting case that has been raised by many papers in the literature as puzzling, given the fact that they find almost complete pass-through of the US tariff on US import prices, which is puzzling from the point of view of standard frameworks in international trade. Now here, what I'm taking the source of this data of the market shares is UN Comtrade data. So it's aggregate data. This is not market share at the individual firm level. But again, this is just for expositional purposes to tell you where we are going with this framework. So in the case of washing machine, what we observe is that the share of China as the supplier to the US of washing machine is about 46%. Conversely, the share of US as importer for washing machine from China is about 20%. So if we use this information, suppose that these were coming from individual firms, one individual firm from China exporting to the US and one individual firm importing from China, and then our model would suggest that we could be in either of these three cases, depending on how the bargaining power is split among importers and exporters. So obviously, this again, in the standard case, where we assume that the seller is the price maker and the buyer is a price taker, then the standard framework would predict an incomplete pass-through of a shock to the bilateral import prices, which is, again, what we would expect from the Atkinson-Bernstein framework, for instance. However, our framework also says that, well, a situation where we observe a complete pass-through of a shock, a US tariff into US import prices, is not surprising if the bargaining power is more concentrated towards the buyer than towards the seller. So again, our framework, our two-sided market power framework, could rationalize high pass-through rates in the recent US-China trade war. Again, this is not, I'm not making any statement here. This is just an example of how we could use our framework to rationalize existing estimates of pass-through, and this is, what's this is in our to-do list. Similarly, suppose we had a different sector, we were interested in a sector where the configuration of market power and market shares were very different, where, for instance, the market share of the buyer is very large, but the market share of the seller is very small, then our framework predicts an incomplete pass-through regardless of whether the bargaining power is concentrated among the importers or exporters. So all this to say that our model can generate rich patterns of markups and pass-through elasticities than in standard theoretical frameworks. And the pass-through will depend on the microstructure of competition, the key parameters being the elasticity of substitution and the return to scale upstream, as it emerged from your questions. Key forces increasing pass-through elasticity, or anyway generating interesting patterns of pass-through elasticities, are the fact that the market power of buyers and sellers is endogenous, and therefore it changes with the shock itself, and also that the bargaining power has an effect on the markup elasticities. Which of these forces prevail is an empirical question, but the interesting part is that our data and estimates can tell us where in the parameter space we are. Okay, so in the last 5 minutes, I believe, I want to talk to you a little bit about our identification strategy for our main model's elasticity. So unfortunately, I'm not able to show you final results, but this is gonna give you an idea of how we estimate these main parameters. So the key parameters that we have to estimate is this bilateral relative bargaining powers, phi ij, and the elasticity of substitution across foreign intermediate varieties, demand elasticity downstream, and the supply elasticity upstreams. And we do this in the following steps. Now, the elasticity of substitution, rho, and the demand elasticity downstream, there's a not very interesting identification strategy. We exploit variation in trade costs and trade volumes as it is standard in the literature. And similarly, we estimated demand elasticity through variation in prices and importer revenues. So this is, we follow the literature by and large for estimating rho and nu. What's new is how the way we jointly estimate the return to scale parameter upstream and the relative bargaining powers of buyers and sellers. And this is, and let me walk you through our identification strategy. First, we parameterize the bilateral bargaining terms, this phi ij, as a function, as an exponential function of some observables, which we believe affect the bilateral bargaining power of sellers and buyers. In particular, these controls are related party dummy, an age of the relationship, the relative size of these firms, and age. Given this functional form restriction, We then assume that the marginal cost of producing a good does not vary across buyers. So again, this rules out that there are quality differences across buyers within a given seller and product. And in particular, what this allows us to do is to interpret differences in prices across buyers within a given seller and product as differences in markups, effectively. And this is what we're going to use to form a moment condition. So to go slow here, the difference between the price that exporter I charges to importer J and J prime, given our identifying assumption, is going to identify the differences in markups across these two different buyers. Now, given estimates of row and new and all the other observables, the only thing that we don't observe, so we can interpret these differences in markups as a function of differences in these bilateral bargaining terms. So effectively, we could use these equations to form a moment condition, and we can estimate these parameters as the ones that minimize the stack difference between these triplets. Okay, so this was, that's it. Unfortunately, I don't have results, but hopefully I gave you a pretty clear idea of what we're doing in this paper. To summarize, we build a novel data set and provide a novel pricing framework with two-sided market power and heterogeneity. The key takeaway is that, again, bilateral markups, pass-through elasticity depend, importantly, on the configuration of concentration and market power among importers and exporters. And also another takeaway of our framework is that the effect of participation in global value chains on markups and firms' market power is non-trivial, and it depends on the heterogeneity, on the two-sided heterogeneity. In progress is the model validation. I gave you sort of, hopefully I gave you an idea of how we intend to do this model validation. In particular, we want to show whether our model and estimates could rationalize observed pattern of pass-through across industries and firms. Ultimately, we would like to give a sense of what are the most strategic sectors and firms to be targeted for trade policy in the sense of what sectors could yield, the lower pass-through depending on how the market shares is distributed. Again, very much work in progress. I thank you very much for all your comments.
Yeah, well, thank you, Monica. Thanks for coming out. Okay, so now we'll just open up the stream to questions, comments. This is the time for co-authors to get their say too, if they'd like. Just unmute yourself and jump in.
Monica, can you go back to your, can you go back to the picture you had with multiple colors? Because I was so slow to figure out that the color meant the amount of pass-through that then I kind of missed the economics of it. Can you just walk through? So in the Korean washing machine tariff against the washing machines, in your base case, can you just explain the different pass-through for this case? Yeah, why is the right one orange, so almost 100% pass-through, and the left one very low pass-through?
Okay, so in this case would be full seller power. So the bargaining power is concentrated on the seller. Okay, so in this case, the force at play is simply basically this one. So the only force that matters, this is how the pass-through elasticity boils, what the pass-through elasticity boils down to, which means that the only force at play is that when there is a tariff shock that hits, the seller is gonna adjust the markup downward in order to avoid the buyer to switch away from that firm, and then this is basically the standard force.
And that was the one that George was commenting on.
Yes,
he's not sure the substitution is high enough to generate a lot there, but anyway.
Correct, exactly. Now, if we go to this other figure, this is going to be the opposite case of full market power of the buyer. Okay. Right. Then we have these other extra force. So this is just, I'm focusing here on the markup channel. So from the markup point of view, what happens is that if the buyer has all the bargaining power, this is how the pass-through looks like. So it doesn't matter, the seller does not have any bearing basically on the pass-through elasticity. What matters is the buyer. However, as the price increases because of the tariff, the demand of the buyer goes down because there is a negative relationship between price and quantity. But as the quantity decreases, the buyer share, the X, decreases as well. But the markup is a negative function. It's a negative function of the buyer share. So basically, as the buyer share decreases, in a way, the market power of the buyer also decreases. And so the seller can charge a higher markup. This is a force that pulls pass-through in the opposite direction. And it has to do with the endogeneity of buyer power, basically. The fact that the buyer power is very much related to the share of the buyer in a total firm sales, which decreases as the tariff. Basically, intuitively, what happens is as the US imposes a tariff on China, the US is going to buy less from China, but as such, the US as a buyer is going to be less important to China. And now China is going to focus more on sales to Japan. And in this sense, it can charge a higher markup to US buyers because their market power is endogenously decreasing.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because it's kind of counterintuitive, because you'd sort of think if you have all the bargaining power, how come you have to take all the extra price increase?
Yeah.
That's why your immediate thought is it would be not that, but okay.
I agree. You would think that the higher the buyer share, the lower the pass-through. But it's not, it goes in this direction, but the channel is, again, that basically the higher the share. No, wait a second. Yeah. I guess the higher the share, the more you have to lose. That's what I was trying to say. But this is the force. And then there's a third force that I didn't mention, which is the cost channel. Okay, so the marginal cost is increasing in the quantity, in the case with decreasing return to scale. So as the tariff increases, the price increase, total quantity purchase decrease, and then the cost is going to decrease as well. So the cost channel is an extra force that pulls the pass-through down. So these are the three forces that basically are at play.
Can I ask a question? Costas, sorry, I don't have the camera. Hey, Monica.
That is very nice. Your voice.
Yeah. Very nice paper. I think it's very elegant. I felt like you did, like you go through detail about the properties of the bargaining and then all these kind of two-sided matching and so on, and the data. But I feel like the stylized facts, and then they're not. You saw these kind of nice figures, right? Of how, when one thing changes, how the firm responds, they pass through, and so on. And then I'm not sure. I was not sure how to link these model predictions to the stylized facts. So that's one thing I was thinking. Maybe you can bring two things to be closer. Either produce stylized facts the way you would think about the comparative statics you were doing, or some. And the other is like it seems like there are a lot of these papers about market power and so on ultimately talk about aggregate statistics.
Yeah.
And it seems that in this paper you avoided to do that. I don't know if you want to do that, but I'm sure it would be interesting to.
What statistics, Constance?
Aggregate statistics like welfare, aggregate trade. I mean, pass-through is obviously one statistic, but
that actually makes me raises a point I was wondering about is, in this kind of model, why do we care about the pass-through elasticity? Because I thought it was of interest for macroeconomists to think about competitive buyers buying off a price that's changing in response to an exchange rate shock. But here the buyers have monopsony power. So we're not thinking of them as price takers anyway. So the price itself, I'm not sure why the price itself is that interesting for welfare purposes. And the question is, why not just go ahead and look at the welfare consequences of these shocks rather than the consequences for this variable that they're each affecting?
Yeah, and then actually maybe an iteration to this series of comments is like in many papers that think about the aggregates, the pass-through is the key sufficient statistic for the aggregate. And there are many of those. I mean, so maybe that's, that's another way to iterate on Jonathan's comment.
Yeah, no, absolutely. These are all well taken. We were focusing on pass-through. I mean, I guess one reason why we didn't think about doing aggregate welfare calculations is that our framework is partial equilibrium, and therefore it's sort of, the pass-through application being a very important one in international literature, and in particular, given the fact that there is sort of this puzzling evidence, that has emerged from recent work calling for more research on this topic, we were thinking to bridge the sort of this open question in the literature with the role of large firms, and turns out that this theory could provide a rationale for this large observed pass-through. Anyway, like that doesn't mean that we didn't think of it, but this is a direction that we're gonna go on. I mean, we're gonna think about doing.
I think in the context, for example, of the China tariff war, partial equilibrium is fine. There's a tariff on washing machines, so I don't think you want to think about that in GE, but you can still think about bargaining between the Chinese producers and I don't know who's buying them, Walmart or something.
Yeah, absolutely. No, we're gonna think about that. Thanks.
And I think Costas, like I mean, I think you're right. We can do a better job connecting in the stylized facts. We were more worried about being able to show that there are some interesting variation that we're going to exploit at the buyer-seller HS level. So that's why we want to show that that's still what was relevant and important. So to give light to the channel. But yeah, I think it's a point well taken that we can do a better job trying to connect later on as a comparative statics with the model itself.
Yeah, it's one, just to mention, there's a student by Yale, Lucas Avalas here, and it's a little bit related topic, but I do like how he has in the beginning the stylized facts, like in a way that they connect ultimately to the simple comparative statics of like firms having more power or exporters having more power in his case, getting bigger part of the revenue and so on. So you could just do something very simple. It's a simpler stylized fact that will connect better to the model. That's what I'm saying. But what you have is obviously very nice.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I would have liked to see you run the cross-sectional regressions in the model before thinking about pass-through. I was surprised that you didn't do that, and that you wanted to talk about pass-through. That just seems like the first order. Usually you think about explaining levels and then changes. So it just seemed like a straightforward thing to start from. So can I ask you? So you had this idea that you wanted to add all of these kind of time dimensions to the bargaining weights in your empirical setup, like age, and I didn't see anything in the model that would let me think that age of the relationship would matter. What do you think those things are going to, proxy for? Is it something where like the longer you're in a relationship, the more specific the product is becoming to you, or?
Well, there is evidence that, for instance, Sebastian Heise's job market paper, he was providing evidence that prices are significant. I mean, there is a dynamics of prices within the age of the relationship. So obviously, prices are higher when the relationship is sort of younger, and lower as the relationship gets old. It has to do with reputational concerns, I believe, you know. But anyway, the control for age was related to this evidence that there seems to be again a life cycle of prices within the relationship.
But it just seems
the idea,
like,
yeah,
just putting it in the weight seems like a little bit kind of pretty reduced form. I didn't know if there was something about these relationships that you can kind of point to that would say, you know, the product becomes like more tailored, or the you know, like I was talking about, the volumes go up, and so that's why you buy more, or something about that. I just likewise, you know, I think it's a question of like, is it the weight that's changing, or is it the outside option that's changing?
Okay, no, this is actually something that I wanted to say also in response to Joachim's, that I think I still owe him. I don't know if he's still there, but I owe him a better response. So he was talking about this outside option.
Yep.
And these are basically, this is where I was going earlier. I forgot to mention. So this is our weighting factor, the definition of our weighting factor. And you see here, it's a function of the relative bargaining powers, this is our free parameter, the parameter that we identify with our, you know, strategy that I talked about at the end, plus this lambda term, lambda ij, and this is effectively has to do in the way we derive the equilibrium. This is what comes from the endogenous bias outside option, this pi tilde, you know, what the profits that this firm would make had the link between I and J broke down. So as you can see from here, so there is basically, these two parameters are very isomorphic. The role that they have in the equilibrium markup is isomorphic. So this exogenous parameter that we don't know what is determined by, this phi ij tilde, and this endogenous outside option. So what I'm saying here is that basically we don't really know what this outside option bargaining powers is determined by, and therefore we're trying to account for all the potential variables that may have an impact on this term, which is, you know, what matters for us and what matters for our basically outside option. So in that sense, it's kind of like a residual. We're going to interpret it as a structural residual, the way we estimate these bilateral bargaining parameters, and we're going to feed it with what we think that can affect the relative bargaining position of a firm. Yeah, that's something
so you could just force it to be a constant and see how far you get with the variation in SIJF, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's
would be something kind of like, can you reject that as a perfectly adequate explanation? But how come, very roughly speaking, how come your other share doesn't show up in this equation somewhere?
The buyer's share?
Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't.
It seems kind of asymmetric.
The buyer share, it is asymmetric. It is. The buyer share only enters in.
Because why can't the buyer leave? And I mean, it seems kind of there should be some symmetry of the seller saying forget it, and the buyer saying forget it. So
it is very asymmetric, the role of the seller's market share and the buyer's market share in the model. In particular, the buyer's market share only matters if there is return to scale upstream. It's only through the effect on the total cost effectively, whereas the seller's market share has a much larger impact. Yeah. However, you're right. Like one thing that we could do is we can just say that the outside option is a constant. You know, we can treat it as as a free parameter, and potentially, the results wouldn't change. So we could either impose more assumption on one or the other, and that would, I believe, it won't be any different for us. Yeah.
Great. I've taken over the MC duties. Is there anyone else who wants to add anything? Or Vanessa, Michele, do you want to add anything? All right, so we'll see everyone. We'll